Imagine a castle where every brick contains fragments of human bones, where the mortar is mixed with ground skulls, and where the walls literally whisper with the voices of the dead. This isn't a horror movie. This is the real fortress that Vlad the Impaler built in 1462, using the skeletons of over 500 enemies as construction materials. When visitors approached Poenari Castle, they weren't just seeing stone walls. They were looking at the physical remains of everyone who had dared to cross the man history knows as Dracula. The smell of death never left the walls, and guards reported hearing ghostly voices echoing from the bone-filled stones. But here's the most chilling part. Vlad didn't build this castle to terrify his enemies. He built it because he genuinely believed it was beautiful. Hit like and subscribe for more of history's most disturbing architectural nightmares. The sound of bones being crushed echoed through the valleys of Wallachia like the roar of a hungry demon devouring human souls to build its earthly lair. It was 1462, and Vlad Tepes, the prince whom history would know as Dracula, ordered that every stone of his new fortress be mixed with fragments of the skeletons of his dead enemies. It was not merely a matter of economizing on construction materials, but a macabre declaration of power that would make any invader immediately understand they were treading on territory sacred to death. Each brick of Poenari's walls contained mortal remains of treacherous boyars, Ottoman soldiers, dishonest merchants, and anyone who had dared challenge the authority of Eastern Europe's most feared prince. The castle was not just a military fortification, but a monument to the philosophy of terror that Vlad had elevated to the level of political art. Construction began in the winter of 1459, when Vlad decided he needed a fortress that would be not only militarily impenetrable, but psychologically devastating to anyone who dared approach its walls. The chosen location was a rocky cliff in the Carpathian Mountains, a place that was already naturally haunting, where wind howled between the peaks like laments of tormented souls, and where mist clung to the slopes like spectral fingers trying to drag the living into the realm of the dead. But Vlad was not content with the natural horror of the place. He decided to amplify the terror through construction methods that would shock even the brutal standards of the medieval era. The first bones incorporated into the foundations came from a mass execution that Vlad ordered specifically to inaugurate the construction. 500 boyars from the region, local nobles who had conspired against his father years before, were summoned to an apparently reconciliatory feast at Poenari Castle. Vlad received them with smiles and embraces, offered them the finest wine from his cellars, and treated them as honored guests throughout the night. When the banquet ended, and the guests were intoxicated with alcohol and false security, the prince gave a silent signal, and armed soldiers emerged from the shadows like demons emerging from hell. Within minutes, 500 men were captured, tortured, and executed with an efficiency that revealed meticulous planning. But the death of the boyars was only the beginning of the horror. Vlad ordered that the bodies be left in the open air for weeks, rotting under sun and rain, until the flesh completely separated from the bones. Ravens and wolves feasted on the corpses for days, creating a spectacle of decomposition that could be seen and smelled for miles around. When finally only clean skeletons remained, Vlad ordered them to be carefully collected, classified by size and strength, and then ground into different granulations to be used as construction material. The strongest bones were coarsely ground to mix with stones in the foundations, while smaller bones were finely pulverized to create a macabre mortar that would unite the stones of the walls. The masons working on the construction were a mixture of forced artisans and prisoners of war who had chosen to work on the castle rather than die impaled. Many of them were religious men who were horrified by the sacrilegious nature of their work, but who had no choice but to obey or join the bones they were mixing into the mortar. Some tried to refuse and were immediately executed, their own skeletons being added to the construction materials as an objective lesson for the remaining workers. The master mason, an Italian named Giorgio Manetti, left a secret diary where he described the workers building with tears and nightmares, erecting walls that smell of death and whisper curses to those who touch them. The construction technique developed by Vlad was simultaneously ingenious and macabre. The bones were first boiled in enormous cauldrons to remove any trace of flesh, then dried in the sun until completely dehydrated. The largest were broken into fist-sized fragments and mixed with regular stones, in the proportion of 1/3 bones to 2/3 stone. The smaller ones were ground to powder and mixed with lime and clay to create a mortar that had a slightly yellowish color and a smell that never completely disappeared no matter how much time passed. When it rained, the walls exuded a sweet and putrid odor that made visitors vomit and horses refuse to approach the castle. As construction progressed, Vlad continued supplying materials through regular executions that became almost ritualized in their regularity and creativity. Merchants who tried to cheat in their dealings were impaled on stakes around the castle until they died. Then their bones were added to the walls. Soldiers who deserted from the Wallachian army were hunted like animals, and when captured, not only killed, but their entire families were executed to provide extra materials for construction. Peasants who refused to pay taxes were burned alive in their own homes, and when the flames died out, special teams searched through the ashes for bones that could be salvaged. The most disturbing aspect of the construction was not just the macabre origin of the materials, but the way Vlad personally supervised every aspect of the process. He regularly inspected the works, testing the quality of mortar made from human bones, suggesting improvements in the technique of crushing skeletons, and even physically participating in the work when he wanted to demonstrate a specific point. Workers reported that the prince seemed genuinely proud of his architectural innovation, discussing the technical merits of using different types of human bones as if he were an engineering specialist discussing the benefits of different types of stone or wood. As the walls rose, Vlad began categorizing the bones according to the crimes of their former owners. The bones of traitors were used in the foundations, buried deep in the earth as a symbol that treachery would be trampled for all eternity. The bones of cowards were mixed into the mortar of the outer walls, forced to defend the castle in death, since they had failed to defend Wallachia in life. The bones of thieves were incorporated into the walls of vaults and treasuries, condemned to forever guard the wealth they had tried to steal. It was a form of poetic justice that revealed a mind that had transformed cruelty into philosophy and revenge into a political system. The castle towers were built with the bones of Vlad's most hated enemies: Ottoman ambassadors who had tried to bribe him, Hungarian nobles who had supported his rivals, and foreign mercenaries who had fought against Wallachia. Each tower was dedicated to a specific type of treachery, and Vlad made a point of explaining to his visitors what category of crime each structure represented. The main tower, where he kept his private quarters, was built with the bones of members of his own family who had conspired against him, a brutal declaration that not even blood ties would prevent him from punishing those who betrayed him. The construction process lasted almost 3 years, during which the castle became a macabre attraction that drew morbid visitors from all over Europe. Diplomats reported to their courts that Poenari's walls were built not with stones, but with sins transformed into physical substance, and that approaching the castle was like entering hell itself while still alive. Pope Pius II sent a special delegation to investigate the rumors about the construction, but the papal legates were so horrified by what they saw that they refused to enter the castle and returned to Rome with reports that were kept secret for decades. But the most sinister aspect of the castle was not just its construction with human bones, but the psychological effects it had on all who lived in or visited the place. Vlad's own soldiers, men hardened by years of brutal warfare, reported constant nightmares when standing guard on the walls. They said they could hear whispers coming from the stones, moans of pain that seemed to come from the very bones incorporated into the construction. Some guards went completely insane, claiming they saw ghosts of the dead walking through the corridors and that they felt skeletal hands touching them when they patrolled alone at night. Vlad himself seemed immune to the psychological effects of his macabre creation, or perhaps it was exactly the type of environment that his disturbed mind found comforting. He conducted important political meetings in the Great Hall, built with bones of treacherous diplomats, dined in a dining room whose walls contained remains of dishonest merchants, and slept in a bedroom where the mortar was made with bones of assassins who had tried to kill him. For Vlad, living surrounded by the remains of his enemies was the supreme proof of his victory over all those who had tried to destroy him. The castle's reputation spread so quickly that it began to serve as a psychological weapon by itself. Enemies of Wallachia, who heard about the fortress built with human bones, often abandoned their invasion plans before even crossing the country's borders. The mere idea of having to attack a structure, made literally with the remains of other defeated invaders, was psychologically devastating to superstitious soldiers who already saw Vlad as a kind of incarnated demon. The castle functioned as terror propaganda on a scale never before seen in military history. The techniques Vlad employed became increasingly sophisticated as construction progressed. Different types of bone served specific architectural purposes based on their structural properties. Femurs and tibias, being the strongest bones in the human body, were reserved for load-bearing walls and foundation cornerstones. Skulls were carefully hollowed out and used as decorative elements embedded in walls, their empty eye sockets creating an intimidating visual effect that seemed to watch visitors wherever they went. Rib cages were flattened and layered to create reinforcement matrices within the walls, while smaller bones from hands and feet were ground into the finest powder to create a specialized mortar that dried harder than conventional lime-based alternatives. The castle's design incorporated deliberate psychological elements beyond mere construction materials. Vlad commissioned artisans to carve bone fragments into grotesque shapes before incorporating them into the walls, creating patterns and images that told the stories of how each enemy had died. Visitors walking through corridors could read the castle walls like a macabre library, with each section detailing different methods of execution and the crimes that had warranted such punishment. The main entrance featured an archway constructed entirely from the skulls of Ottoman generals, arranged in ascending order of military rank, with the skull of a pasha occupying the keystone position. The environmental impact of the castle's construction created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that extended far beyond its walls. The massive quantities of human remains processed for building materials contaminated the surrounding soil with decomposition byproducts, creating an ecosystem unlike anywhere else in the region. Plants that grew near the castle developed unusual characteristics. Flowers bloomed in unnatural colors, trees grew in twisted, tormented shapes, and even the grass seemed to writhe and move in ways that disturbed both animals and humans. Local wildlife avoided the area entirely, creating an eerie silence broken only by the constant moaning of wind through the bone-filled walls. Weather patterns around the castle also seemed affected by its macabre construction. Storms appeared to gather more frequently above Poenari than in surrounding areas, and lightning strikes were unusually common, as if the very atmosphere was rebelling against the unholy structure. During winter months, when snow accumulated on the walls, meltwater running down the castle's exterior would sometimes carry a reddish tinge, leading local peasants to believe the stones themselves were bleeding. These phenomena only enhanced the castle's reputation as a cursed place where the natural order had been fundamentally disturbed. Vlad's personal quarters within the castle represented the ultimate expression of his bone-building philosophy. His private chambers were constructed using only the remains of those who had personally betrayed him, family members, trusted advisors, and close friends who had turned against him. The walls of his bedroom were embedded with skulls of 3 of his brothers who had conspired with Hungarian nobles, while the floor was inlaid with a mosaic made from the ground bones of his former wife, who had attempted to poison him during a dinner banquet. Vlad slept every night surrounded by the physical remains of those closest to him, a twisted form of intimacy that spoke to the profound psychological damage that years of warfare and betrayal had inflicted upon his mind. The castle's defensive capabilities were enhanced by its psychological impact on potential attackers. Military engineers of the period noted that conventional siege warfare became nearly impossible when facing an enemy fortification that induced such profound fear in attacking forces. Soldiers approaching Poenari's walls often suffered from what would today be recognized as panic attacks, rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, and overwhelming sensations of dread that made coordinated military action impossible. Some mercenary companies refused contracts that involved attacking the castle, regardless of payment offered, creating a practical defensive advantage that was as effective as any moat or cannon. Religious authorities throughout Europe were deeply divided on how to respond to Vlad's architectural innovations. Some church leaders condemned the construction as a blasphemous desecration of human remains that violated fundamental Christian principles about treating the dead with dignity. Others argued that since the bones belonged to enemies of the faith, particularly Ottoman Muslims and treacherous Christians, Their use in construction could be considered a form of posthumous service to God. This theological debate raged for decades and contributed to Vlad's complex reputation as either a defender of Christianity or a demon who had crossed moral boundaries that should never be breached. The castle's construction attracted attention from scholars, architects, and natural philosophers across Europe who were fascinated by both its engineering innovations and its psychological implications. Visiting academics documented construction techniques, studied the chemical properties of bone-based mortar, and analyzed the structural advantages of incorporating human remains into masonry. Some of these scholarly investigations were conducted in secret, as being associated with Vlad's methods could damage a researcher's reputation. But the knowledge gained from studying Poenari's construction influenced architectural practices for generations. International diplomatic relations were significantly impacted by the castle's existence. Foreign ambassadors visiting Wallachia found themselves in the awkward position of conducting negotiations while staying in guest quarters built with human bones. Many diplomats reported feeling constantly nauseated during their visits, unable to eat or sleep properly while surrounded by the macabre construction. Some ambassadors refused to enter the castle at all, insisting on conducting negotiations in tents erected at a safe distance from the bone-filled walls. These diplomatic difficulties became part of Vlad's strategy for maintaining negotiating advantages, as visiting dignitaries were often eager to conclude their business quickly and leave. The castle's influence extended beyond its immediate political and military functions to impact cultural and artistic expression throughout the region. Local folk songs began incorporating references to the bone castle, creating a musical tradition that preserved stories about Vlad's methods for future generations. Visual artists attempted to capture the castle's horror in paintings and drawings, though many found the reality too disturbing to accurately represent. These artistic interpretations often emphasize supernatural elements, ghostly figures, unnatural lighting, and symbolic representations of evil that reflected contemporary attempts to process and understand the psychological impact of Vlad's creation. Economic consequences of the castle's construction rippled throughout Wallachia and neighboring regions. The massive labor requirements for processing human remains and constructing bone-filled walls required specialized workers who commanded premium wages due to the disturbing nature of their work. Traditional stone masons and construction workers often refused to participate, leading to labor shortages that affected other building projects throughout the principality. The psychological trauma experienced by workers also created long-term economic costs, as many craftsmen suffered from what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, reducing their productivity and ability to work on conventional projects. Trade relationships with neighboring countries were also affected by the castle's reputation. Merchants traveling through Wallachia often requested alternative routes that avoided passing near Poenari, even if such detours added days to their journeys. The castle's psychological impact on travelers created practical challenges for maintaining commercial relationships, as foreign traders associated the entire principality with the horror of Vlad's bone construction. Some trade agreements specifically included clauses allowing merchants to cancel contracts if required to conduct business near the castle. The castle's water supply systems incorporated macabre elements that reflected Vlad's comprehensive approach to bone-based construction. Wells were lined with skulls arranged in geometric patterns, and aqueducts included bone fragments in their mortar joints. Even the castle's drainage systems utilized hollowed-out long bones as primitive pipes, creating a water infrastructure that was both functional and terrifying. Visitors often reported that water from castle wells had an unusual taste and smell, leading to speculation that dissolved bone minerals were affecting the water chemistry. Military innovations inspired by the castle's construction included new siege warfare techniques specifically designed to counter psychological defense strategies. Enemy commanders developed methods for protecting their troops from the demoralizing effects of attacking bone-fortified positions, including religious ceremonies, alcohol distribution, and propaganda campaigns designed to counter the fear-inducing properties of human remains-based architecture. These military adaptations represented the first systematic study of psychological warfare in siege operations. The castle's legacy influenced architectural practices throughout Eastern Europe for centuries after Vlad's death. While few builders attempted to replicate the use of human bones as construction materials, the psychological principles underlying Poenari's design inspired fortress builders to incorporate intimidating elements into defensive structures. Castles built in subsequent decades often featured skull motifs, bone-like architectural details, and deliberately disturbing visual elements designed to demoralize potential attackers. Archaeological investigations of the castle ruins in modern times have confirmed the extensive use of human remains in construction, while raising new questions about the scale and methods of Vlad's bone-gathering operations. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed massive bone deposits beneath and around the castle foundations, suggesting that the structure incorporated far more human remains than historical accounts had indicated. Chemical analysis of mortar samples has identified bone fragments from hundreds of different individuals, providing scientific validation for the most extreme claims about the castle's macabre construction. Modern forensic analysis of bone fragments recovered from the castle walls has revealed information about the demographics of Vlad's victims and the methods used to process their remains. Age analysis suggests that victims ranged from children to elderly adults, indicating that Vlad's bone-gathering operations targeted entire populations rather than just military enemies. Evidence of tool marks on bone fragments provides insights into the mechanical processes used to prepare skeletal remains for construction, revealing a level of systematic organization that underscores the calculated nature of Vlad's approach. Environmental studies of the castle site have documented long-term ecological effects of the bone-based construction that persist into the present day. Soil composition around the ruins shows elevated calcium and phosphorus levels that continue to affect plant growth patterns 5 centuries after construction. Some species of vegetation in the immediate vicinity display unusual growth characteristics that researchers attribute to the unique mineral composition created by decomposed bone materials in the local ecosystem. Psychological studies of visitors to the castle ruins have provided modern insights into the mechanisms by which Vlad's architectural choices achieved their intimidating effects. Researchers have documented physiological responses in tourists that mirror historical accounts of the castle's impact on visitors, including elevated heart rates, increased stress hormones, and altered brainwave patterns associated with fear and anxiety. These studies suggest that the psychological impact of human remains-based architecture operates through deeply ingrained evolutionary responses that remain consistent across cultures and historical periods. The castle's influence on modern horror literature and entertainment reflects its enduring power to disturb and fascinate contemporary audiences. Writers and filmmakers continue to draw inspiration from Vlad's bone castle, using it as a symbol of absolute evil and the corruption of human creativity for malevolent purposes. The structure has become an archetype in popular culture, representing the ultimate expression of megalomania and the willingness to violate fundamental human values in pursuit of power. Today, the ruins of Poenari Castle stand as a UNESCO World Heritage Site that attracts thousands of visitors annually, though many find the experience deeply unsettling even in the structure's deteriorated state. Conservation efforts focus on preserving the remaining bone-mortar walls while respecting the ethical complexities of maintaining a monument built through mass murder. The site serves as both a historical artifact and a moral lesson about the dangers of unchecked authority and the human capacity for transforming cruelty into art. The story of the castle built with enemy bones remains one of history's most extreme examples of architecture as psychological warfare, a physical manifestation of one man's determination to literally build his power upon the destruction of his enemies. Vlad Tepes created not just a fortress, but a monument to the principle that victory over one's foes should extend beyond death itself, forcing the defeated to serve their conqueror for eternity as the very foundation of his strength. The bone castle of Poenari stands as an eternal reminder that human creativity can be corrupted to serve the darkest impulses of the human spirit, creating beauty through horror and strength through the systematic violation of humanity's most fundamental values. Hit like and subscribe for more of history's most disturbing architectural nightmares.